we're starting. Uh-oh, problem? Okay, we're going to start now. Thank you. Oh, wow. I need a microphone every day. This is really good. I really got your attention. I love it. So, thank you all for coming out. I know the weather's pretty good for now. We're grateful for that. Somebody, maybe, I don't remember who, said, I do control the weather. So I'll take credit for wherever I can take credit. So first of all, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it that you've come out today, especially today. And thank you to our speaker, Rafi Prober. You'll hear more about him in a minute. And I want to thank Susan Simon, who is where? Right in front of me, for being my partner in planning this. We're a pretty good team. And before I tell you a little bit about Rafi Prober, I'm going to take a moment of privilege to tell you what I've been thinking about. So some of you know that I really value the telling of personal stories and how these stories connect people over and over again. So as we've been planning for today, I've been struck by the connections in this room as I speak and as Rafi will speak. And there's connections that I've just learned about that I won't be telling you about. So there are more connections that are happening every minute. It's beautiful, really. So number one, we've known Rafi since he was in middle school and went to camp with our boys at Camp Ramah in Palmer, Massachusetts. He spent some time in our living room, in our basement, and it's been a wonderful process to get to know him again as an adult, which is really hard for me to wrap my head around. And two, Susie Shadekel, I was told I could use either pronunciation, who's a member here at Shari Torah, has told me the story that her father was on one of the trains that Rafi is going to be talking about, connection number two. And number three, Carol Resnick, who, if you don't know, is Jen Kramer's husband, was the sponsor or one of the sponsors, the sponsor of the, and you'll correct me if I get it wrong, the Holocaust Rail Justice Act. And so that's the third connection in this room. And I just learned about others, which now I've forgotten about already, so I can't tell you. But there are other connections in this room. So really my point in telling you this is every one of us has a story to tell. We don't always tell our stories. But if we should, I encourage you, tell your stories over and over again if possible, and make those connections over and over again, because it's really valuable to us, to our children and our grandchildren. So that's my soapbox part. So now about Rafi, our speaker, and his involvement with the SNCF, which I've come to learn is the France National Railway. Rafi is now a partner at the Simpson Thacher law firm, and he has dedicated significant time to representing Holocaust survivors and their families in their pursuit of justice. He has been a key advocate for reparations from the SNCF, arguing that the company should be held accountable for their role in the Holocaust. Rafi has played a role in supporting legislation like the act I just told you about, the Holocaust Rail Justice Act, which aims to allow survivors to sue the railways in U.S. courts. And he has engaged with the media and collaborated with organizations like the Coalition for Holocaust Rail Justice to raise awareness, which I think is particularly important because I thought that I knew a little bit about the Holocaust and I knew nothing about this. So I'm really glad you're in the room to learn. I'm guessing that there are a lot of you in the room who didn't know very much about it. And he is one of the people behind the podcast Covering Their Tracks. The podcast explores the story of Leo Bretholtz, who escaped from a train and highlights the SNCF's role in the Holocaust. So, Rafi, your turn.
All right. Well, thank you, Connie. I appreciate the introduction, and thanks to everyone for having me. And just on a personal note to Connie and Ellen and Jonathan and Beth and Krill and Jonathan Bromberg, who's the best estate attorney out there, I have to say, and many, many, many friends and just connections. It's really nice to be here. So thank you for having me. I have a presentation, but I'm happy to take questions as we go, or sort of give you additional background if it's interesting. What I was planning to do today, and Connie mentioned there's a podcast, which I'll tell you a bit about as well, and play some clips. And I think actually one of the ones I had selected actually has Kirill in it without me even realizing he was going to be here. So it was Bashir. But I want to tell you a little bit about the factual background of what happened and sort of what led from lawsuit to legislation to diplomacy to settlement ultimately. Talk about the litigation and legislative history, the strategy. There's federal legislation, there's state level legislation, including very importantly in Maryland. There was high-speed rail development and issues, state legislative strategy, communications and PR. Ultimately, 2014, we end up in the State Department, which I'll come back to, and then sort of impact and broader considerations as this was all unfolding on the world stage, and with lots of anti-Semitism around the world, lots more overtly today than we were aware of then, and just this sort of moment in time when we were able to get this agreement completed. So before I tell you about the factual background, I'm going to advance the slide and just play a bit from the podcast called Covering Their Tracks, which tells the story of this case and the survivors' stories, but also goes into France during the war, issues of complicity, coercion, and up through sort of modern day. We were wrapping up production of the podcast right as October 7th happened, so we ended up including in the final episode more of a discussion on modern day anti-Semitism and where things are, including with some haunting historical tape that we had from Leo Brettholtz, who had passed away years before, but spoke about how vigilant we all need to be to make sure that it really doesn't happen again and that it could. So this picture is a much younger version of me with Leo Brettholtz, who was a Pikesville resident who Kirill knows well. I'm going to talk about Leo today. Leo was the main proponent of the legislation. He was really the face of the campaign. He jumped off of a moving SNCF train bound for Auschwitz. As a 17-year-old boy, managed to pry the bars of the cattle car open, and him and his friend Manfred jumped from the moving train and managed to survive the rest of the war, running throughout Europe, and ultimately settled in Baltimore and Pikesville. And Leo led the national campaign for this with us, and actually passed away just 2 days before a hearing in Maryland, which we'll talk about on Kirill's legislation, and just months before the global settlement. And Rosette Goldstein, who's to my left in that photo, was Leo's partner in crime. Rosette is still very much alive and kicking and traveling the country and telling her story. Her father was on an SNCF train, sent to Buchenwald and never returned. And she had been very, very active as well. But when Leo passed away, she stepped in and really helped to push this over the finish line. And she's wonderful. We'll talk a little bit more about her, but I'm still in very close touch with her, and she's still telling her story, as Connie said, as often as she can, which is incredibly important. So let's see. I'm just going to play a couple minutes from the introduction of the podcast, which will give you a sense of the broader story and the arc here.
I'm Matthew Slutsky, and this is Covering Their Tracks, the extraordinary story of the SNCF's denial of its history and how storytelling can be used to confront the past and achieve justice.
During World War II, France's state-run railway known as SNCF transported thousands of Jews to their deaths in Nazi prison camps.
We have memories that haunt us and will haunt us to our dying day.
They were paid per head per kilometer to transport people, human beings.
You must try to get off the train so somebody will remember, somebody will tell the story of what happened to us.
I'm announcing my administration's efforts to transform travel in America with an historic investment in high-speed rail.
SNCF has never accepted moral or financial responsibility for its actions. And until it does so, it should not be permitted to get taxpayer money.
70 years is far too long to wait for a company to accept responsibility for the death and suffering it caused.
Those are the voices of Holocaust survivors, newscasters, lawyers, Senator Joe Lieberman, and President Barack Obama. They're all talking about trains, and that's the story that brings us here. Today, the French National Railroad, known as SNCF, exists as a pinnacle of train travel, a Fortune 500 company. During World War II, however, the railway was complicit in the Holocaust, transporting approximately 76,000 French Jews, in addition to countless others, including American POWs, toward Nazi concentration camps around Europe. Over the next 5 episodes, you'll hear about the clash of business, law, government, corporate and moral accountability, and of a diplomatic crisis that would go to the highest levels of the U.S. and French governments. One man would even manage to leap from one of these trains speeding towards Auschwitz, and he would ultimately tell the world his story. But to set the table, we're going to start in post-war France.
Okay, so that's the introduction to the podcast, which I'll talk a little bit more about how that all came together some years after the case. This is just, and it's probably a little bit difficult to see, so I'll just run through quickly with a high-level sketch, and then in some of the subsequent slides we'll go a little bit deeper, but this is just kind of the big picture arc of the whole case. So as you heard in that first clip, SNCF is the French National Railroad, owned by the French government. Same corporate structure today as it had during the war. The reason that is relevant is that the original attempt to seek justice from SNCF for deporting 76,000 Jews and thousands of others toward the camps and getting paid per head and per kilometer for doing so was in a court of law, which would make sense, and that's sort of the first place you would think someone would seek redress. The Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act was passed in 1976, and without going into too many details, it makes it very difficult for someone in the United States to sue a foreign sovereign, absent certain exceptions being met, on the theory that you don't want everyday people to be able to haul a foreign government into court in the United States, again, absent some very specific exceptions, because it'll undermine diplomacy, and it's the role of the executive branch and the State Department to conduct diplomacy. If anyone has seen the movie The Woman in Gold with Ryan Reynolds and Helen Mirren, you remember there was a case about the Klimt painting in 2004. In the category of you can't make this stuff up, that case was about foreign sovereign immunity. And what it determined, so our case was proceeding, what that case in 2004, the Supreme Court decision, determined was that foreign sovereign immunity was retroactive pre-1976. So before the passage, it would cover official state conduct before that, which resulted in Helen Mirren and Ryan Reynolds getting the painting back, and a very successful and happy outcome in that case and in the movie. It also, however, knocked us out of court because we did not qualify under an exception to foreign sovereign immunity. So the impact of that decision, ironically, was to knock our plaintiffs, who were going after the French National Railroad, out of court. So in 2004, as a result of that, everyone sort of circled up and had to figure out how else to approach this if there wasn't going to be a path in the courts. And that's what led to some of the legislative efforts on the federal level and then the state level. So that you see there, 2004 is the Altman case I mentioned. In 2005 and 2006, Senator Schumer and then Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney and Ileana Ros-Lehtinen introduced in the Senate and the House the Holocaust Rail Justice Act that was an attempt to provide a day in court for the survivors, notwithstanding foreign sovereign immunity. In 2009, as President Obama announced high-speed rail, and the French, along with a number of other foreign governments, were bidding to build high-speed rail in the U.S. You saw a state-level effort pop up, which we'll talk about more. It started in California. It then moved over to Maryland in 2011. There was the first iteration of the legislation that Delegate Sandy Rosenberg led. The second iteration that came during very sensitive and important State Department discussions, then Delegate Resnick led, and it was all of these efforts. There were also pushes in Florida and New York. All of these different pieces, including the federal piece, which was still ongoing, resulted in enough pressure and diplomatic pressure, legislative pressure, creating an environment where there was actually a chance that SNCF might be hauled into U.S. court. There was a very distinct possibility. The State Department started to get nervous about it. The French started to get nervous about it. And that led to people coming to the table beginning in 2012 and ultimately a resolution in December of 2014. Kirill and I were at the treaty room at the State Department watching what was, I think, probably the proudest professional moment or personal that I will have, maybe ever, watching the equivalent of a treaty be signed between the U.S. and France, where France agreed to pay the U.S. $60 million to be dispersed to survivors and family members of some of those who are impacted, with no legal fees, and it really was life-altering for a lot of survivors who, unfortunately, a large number live below the poverty line, and it was incredibly impactful for a lot of survivors, in addition to the apologies that had come and some of the more sincere apologies that would come from the state of France going forward. So that's sort of the big picture. And I'll go deeper on all of this because the story is really pretty fascinating when you get into some of the details. But just to give you my own background on this, my mom's family, her father is from Lithuania. Other than him and his youngest daughter, the entire family was killed in Lithuania. So the Holocaust has always been something very important, both to learn from and to continue to talk about. I moved over to the law firm Aiken Gump at the time in 2008, and this case quite literally landed on my desk. And it was at that time something that no one thought was going to go anywhere. And it was a federal legislative effort to try to pass the Holocaust Rail Justice Act. It was a sleepy bill that had a few co-sponsors and was unlikely to go anywhere. And we were able to build a national campaign, really on the back of the French rail company coming here to compete for $100 billion in taxpayer dollars. We were able to build a national campaign with wonderful support from Kirill and others in Maryland, California, Florida, New York, and around the world, and turn this from a sleepy bill to a front-page issue that couldn't be ignored and ultimately had to be addressed if they wanted to move past it. So that's my own personal connectivity to it. Since then, as Connie said, I've been very involved in helping to bring this podcast to life, which has been wonderful. It's been distributed through Tablet Media, if folks are familiar with Tablet. You can download it on Apple and Spotify, and it actually has very recently won Best Nonfiction Podcast of the Year at the Rio Web Fest and was a runner-up for a Webby. So it's been very cool just seeing the story continue to spread and people continuing to hear about Leo's story and Rosette's and what everyone was able to accomplish. And there's even some talk about this being made into a Netflix type series, docu-series, so we shall see. But if anyone has any, aunts or uncles who are producers in Hollywood, let me know. So I talked about this already a little bit, the corporate structure. SNCF remained under French control throughout World War II. They ran the trains, they determined the technical conditions of the transports, they collaborated willingly with the Nazi regime. There were acts of resistance from a large number of SNCF employees, which the company now, going back to when this all bubbled up and to present day, tries to wrap itself in the valor of, but these were individual acts of individual employees who had the courage to do it, who would be fired and often killed for doing it. So it was not any sort of corporate decision to stand in the way of this, but there were a lot of brave individuals who should be commended. So SNCF, as I mentioned, tried to dismiss the lawsuit on claims of foreign sovereign immunity, notwithstanding the fact they're one of the 500 largest corporations in the world. They earn hundreds of millions of dollars from commercial activities in the US, and they are not accorded the same sovereign immunity under the laws of France. So that was the landscape at the time, and notwithstanding any of that, the motion to dismiss was granted in the Eastern District of New York. Plaintiffs appealed. The appeal was granted, and the case was remanded. And then we have the Altman decision, which I mentioned. And coming out of that, the Second Circuit, and this was an opinion written by then Judge Sotomayor, stated, and this quote is really important because this gave rise to the legislative efforts that came next, the railroad's conduct at the time lives on in infamy, but concluded that the evil actions of the French National Railroad's former private masters in knowingly transporting thousands to death camps during World War II are not susceptible to legal redress in federal court today. So that was the reality in 2004. And that gave rise to an effort to carve out foreign sovereign immunity, which was a pretty crazy concept that very few people were excited about, because it's a slippery slope, and if you carve out foreign sovereign immunity for one group, what do you do for the next group? How does this impact the United States abroad and the treatment of Amtrak, or someone who's in a federal building in the U.S. who's injured and tries to sue abroad? So there are very real ramifications. I'll tell you that in a lot of our meetings, the topic of slavery and reparations came up very frontally. So it was not an easy, discrete, sacrosanct issue that you could say, let's just do this because the survivors deserve it. And it was incredibly deserving, but the consequences of doing something like this were going to reverberate in ways that people were really, really worried about. And we would have many meetings on Capitol Hill where congressmen, senators, staff would be crying after meeting with Leo Bratholtz and hearing his story, but would say, unfortunately, we can't do anything because if we just can't carve out foreign sovereign immunity for one instance. And that was the reality right up until SNCF decided to come here and bid for taxpayer dollars for high-speed rail, and then we were able to change the reality a little, but we'll get to that. So this is just the Holocaust Rail Justice Act. It was, when it was first introduced with that name, it was HR 1193 and S 634 in the Senate. As I mentioned, it started out with just a couple co-sponsors, Carolyn Maloney in the House and Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, and folks may be familiar with Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. She was the longtime chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee from Miami. She's fantastic. She's wonderful on issues that I know we all care about, and has been a real friend to the Jews and to Israel, and very, very focused on survivor issues because she cares about it, and also given her constituency. And Senator Schumer was very focused on this as well. So the strategy, and you can see here, this is the first federal hearing. That's Leo Brett Holtz testifying in front of Congress. And you can see, again, a much younger version of me over his right shoulder. And actually over his left shoulder, the older gentleman, his name is Don Shear. He was a US pilot who was non-Jewish, who was shot down over France during the war, ended up getting stuck, thank God, in a tree, survived the fall, and was picked up and put on an SNCF train and sent to Buchenwald. So it's a little known fact that a lot of the US POWs were not sent to POW camps, but were actually sent to concentration camps. And there's a documentary called The Lost Airmen of Buchenwald about this. And I remember shortly before this, we were in a private briefing, and Don Shear and Leo were telling their stories to a packed room. And I had a moment of just sort of stepping back and thinking, so we have a guy who jumped off a moving train and a guy who got shot out of the sky. This has to come together and work. Ultimately it did, but you could not imagine more compelling stories from people who had been there and were able to recount it. So, the real goal was just amplifying those stories and creating an opportunity for Leo and Don Shear and Rosette and others to tell their firsthand stories about this. I've talked a little bit about the pitfalls with the legislation, so carving out foreign sovereign immunity. There was also the passage of time. It was just hard to get people really energized and focused on this without some catalyzing event. And France and SNCF coming to the US for high-speed rail turned out to be that event. But when this effort began, it was not. We had a lot of great meetings and a lot of difficulty really getting people to focus on this. There's also the issue of France being the US's oldest ally, so which means a lot, and there's a lot of different aspects and layers to that relationship, and this was the most important one to us, but it was just one of many to the State Department and to the executive branch, and that was a reality that we were confronting as well. There was something called iCheck. I forget what it stood for, but it was the insurance, life insurance. If folks remember, there was a life insurance settlement that was moving in parallel at the same time around 2014 with a lot of the life insurance policies for those who had perished in the Holocaust. And it was a much different case. There had been an international settlement. There was an effort to open it up because it wasn't effective enough. There was a Supreme Court case. Because there were two sort of parallel pieces of kind of similar Holocaust legislation, we got grouped together. And this hearing, actually, Leo was testifying on our issue. There was another survivor who was testifying on the iCheck legislation. And it got very confusing and very difficult because even though I knew more than I remember now, but at the time, all of the details of the differences, they got lumped together. And the challenge was that was a situation where you actually already had an international agreement and it was being challenged and opened up. We never even had a day in court. So they were two very, very, very different cases, but getting members of Congress in the same hearing to appreciate that there were two different things happening was often tough, and they couldn't figure out who was working with who, and we got lumped together with them a lot, which was not helpful, but you also wanted to be careful not to say, well, our issue is more meritorious, or our issue should be heard first. It was a different issue, but sort of separating ourselves in the right, delicate way was a challenge. SNCF also launched the biggest lobbying blitz I could have ever imagined, which I'm sure Kirill remembers well. There were years that they were spending north of $1 million lobbying against the survivors and against the Holocaust Rail Justice Act. Their first response to all of this was to turn their high-speed rail website, which should have been used to introduce the company and their capabilities to the US, into a referendum on their role in the Holocaust with a myth versus fact. And I just remember thinking at the time, like, this is great. The more they are talking about the Holocaust, the better. And it ended up being sort of a Harvard business school case study and how not to approach a crisis situation. And honestly, I'm not sure this would have resolved this way, but for their approach and like their very uniquely French approach on a lot of this, honestly. Like they gave us a lot of gifts that we were able to capitalize on. So we ended up with 2 hearings in front of Congress, one in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee that Ileana Ross-Layton chaired, and one in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee that Patrick Leahy was the chair at the time, and he gave the gavel to Chuck Schumer to chair at that hearing. As I mentioned, the high-speed rail component of this changed everything in terms of the trajectory of the federal legislation and the state efforts as well. It went from a sleepy piece of legislation originally with a handful of sponsors, like 2, 3, 4 on the House and the Senate versions, to, at the height of it, 50-plus co-sponsors in the House, 20-plus bipartisan in the Senate, including the majority leader at the time, Harry Reid. And that's what led to the recognition of, oh my gosh, France might get sued in the US for their role in the Holocaust. And France reached out to the State Department. The State Department brought in Stu Eisenstadt, who I'm sure most folks are familiar with. And Stu brought us and the French separately. We were never in a room with the French, but it was a trilateral negotiation, and Stu helped to broker the outcome. So this is Leo testifying in that hearing. I'm going to play his testimony. It's a couple minutes, but it's really just remarkable, and hearing from him what his experience was like on these trains is what changed everything for this campaign and this case, and it never would have gotten over the finish line without Leo, without his courage, and without his dedication to continuing to tell the story, you know, whether it was in high school gyms or classrooms or rooms like this or in front of Congress, and showing up when he was exhausted and getting out of bed when he felt achy and sick and his wife had passed away, you know, shortly before this time period, but finding a way to continue to do it. But for that, none of this would have happened. And it's his story that really made all the difference. And for those who are interested, this is a book that Leo wrote called Leap into Darkness. It's incredible, and you can get it online on Amazon and elsewhere. This is written by Leo and Baltimore Sun reporter Michael Olesker, and it tells Leo's story of the 7 years running during the war, including jumping from the train. And I would highly recommend it to anyone who's interested. But now I'll just play his firsthand account.
SNCF deported 76,000 Jews on those trains, including over 11,000 children. They would count us off, 50 into each cattle car. In the car in front of me, a family was counted off, and the 51st person was a young son. The boy began to scream, and the father pleaded to allow them to stay together, but with cold precision, the boy was shoved into one car, his family into another. I believe that was the last time they saw each other. For the entire journey, SNCF provided was one piece of triangle cheese, one stale piece of bread, and no water. There was hardly room to stand or sit or squat in the cattle car. There was one bucket for us to relieve ourselves. Within that cattle car, people were sitting and standing and praying and weeping, fighting the whole gamut of human emotions. My friend Manfred and I began to try to escape. Many in the cattle car, fearing the guards would punish everyone if we were found out, urged us not to even try. I also was beginning to doubt our plan when an elderly woman on crutches spoke out. She wielded that crutch like a weapon, pointed it at me and said, "You must do it. If you get out," she said, "maybe you can tell the story. Who else will tell the story?" I can still see her face and hear her voice today. Manfred and I set out to pry apart the bars on the windows. First we tried belts, They slipped off. Then someone suggested we dip our sweaters into the human waste on the bottom of the car. We kept twisting the wet sweaters tighter and tighter like a tourniquet. The human waste dripped down our arms. We kept going for hours until finally there was just enough room for us to squeeze through. It was night. I went first, and Manfred helped me climb out the tiny window, stand on the small ledge on the outside of the car. He followed me, and we held on tight so as not to slip and fall beneath the train, and waited for it to take a curve and slow down. Then we jumped to our freedom. Of the 1,000 people with me on the SNCF convoy number 42, only 5 survived the war. If I had not jumped from that train, I wouldn't be here today. It is my duty to speak for those who did not survive, such as the old woman who emboldened us to escape, and for my family that did not survive.
So as you can see, it's just an incredible account, incredible firsthand recitation of what it was like to be on those trains. And Leo told that story over and over and over again. And actually, I remember this, I'm fast forwarding to the slides on Maryland now, but since we're on the subject, he passed away on a Saturday, and there was a hearing on Kirill's legislation on a Monday that Leo was supposed to testify at. And I ended up testifying briefly. Rosette Goldstein testified, and I told that story that Leo just told, and I had heard it 200-300 times directly from him, and it was sort of an out-of-body experience that it was just on autopilot. And I mean, I think I probably used almost exactly the same words because I had heard him tell it so many times, and it really was just, it wasn't an honor because I would have loved him to be there to tell the story, but it was because he had been so committed to telling it and to continuing the fight that others were able to pick it up and to finish the work that he had really started. So backing up a little bit, the first legislative effort was in California. So February 2009, Bob Blumenfield introduces AB 619, the Holocaust Survivor Responsibility Act. There were hearings in California. This is shortly after SNCF put in a 1,000-page proposal to the Federal Railroad Administration about their capabilities to build high-speed rail, which is how this came on our radar. I actually received a Google alert, and I was reading this thing and trying to figure out what was going on, and oh my gosh, it's the same company. This is crazy. Turns out it was. So through then, I think ranking member Howard Berman on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Bob Blumenfield had been his legislative director when he was in Congress, and went back to California and ran. And I wish I could tell you I wish I could tell you that the 32-year-old me had a great national strategy for how to do this whole thing, and it was all drawn up, and we knew, every twist and turn. That was not the case. We actually were sitting in a meeting on the Hill with Howard Berman's folks, and they said, "Oh, you should totally talk to Bob. This would be a great state-level project for him. He'd be all over this." And we did. And we really, this was a windy journey that involved lots and lots of good people and really proactive, thoughtful people who identified others who'd be interested in helping to get involved. The Maryland piece of it was our mutual friend Aaron Greenfield, who read an article and reached out to us and said, "How can I help pro bono? What can I do?" And that really led to the Maryland effort because we aren't Maryland lobbyists. We wouldn't have known how to get this off the ground. So, it was just one of those wonderful twists of fate, but, we talked to enough people who were all interested in trying to help and do the right thing, and that's how we landed on Bob Blumenfield's doorstep. He introduced this legislation. It passed the California Assembly, the Senate, I think almost unanimously. Schwarzenegger vetoed it, which is interesting. The backstory is, there's personal backstory, of course, to Schwarzenegger, but the real reason I believe that he vetoed it, the legislation was drafted broadly enough, and it was just disclosure legislation that said, if you deported, people during World War II to concentration camps or death camps, you have to fill out in connection with bidding for a public contract, yes or no, did you do that? Yes or no, have you opened your archives? And yes or no, have you paid reparations? We stupidly thought that would be enough to shame the French into doing the right thing and moving on with their lives. We were wrong. It would take like 5 or 6 more years with ratcheting up the pressure. But the legislation was actually drafted broadly enough to cover the conduct related to comfort women. And there was a lot of concern in Japan and with U.S. service members, and Japan was very concerned about this. And Japan was also, at the time, bidding for high-speed rail and offering to bail then bankrupt California out to help with building it. So this all bubbled up very shortly before the final vote, and Bob Blumenfield's view was, if they have something to answer for, they should answer for it too. This is not intended, it was intended, really, I'm being, focused on one thing, but if there's other history that should be talked about, I'm not gonna limit it just to this and give someone a free pass, which was 100% the right thing to do, and we supported that and said, the chips will fall where they may. Schwarzenegger was out, I remember reading an article a week or two before he vetoed it, that he was in Japan, touring their facilities and meeting with people. So it wasn't a total surprise, but that was the backstory to how you could have legislation that, passed with such support that ended up being vetoed. But that's okay, because Maryland came storming in, and it worked out, which we'll get to. So this is just a quick piece of the podcast of Bob Blumenfield.
I remember there was a person who was a Holocaust survivor who would literally have this new railroad going through practically his backyard. And the thought of that was just unconscionable to me.
That's former California State Assembly member Bob Blumenfield.
Especially as I learned more and more about SNCF's role and their failure to take responsibility for that role. I started asking the question, why have they never been held accountable?
Okay, so that brings us to Maryland. As I mentioned, there were 2 different efforts in Maryland. The first was in March of 2011, where the CEO of SNCF America actually agreed to testify, which was remarkable. And Curl's laughing because it went so poorly for them, which was a surprise to nobody. But I remember, so Sandy Rosenberg, Delegate Rosenberg from Baltimore, who's fantastic, who's still in the Assembly, led the charge on this legislation. Leo Bretholtz was his constituent. And I remember I got a call from Sandy saying they want to push the date of the hearing. And would we be willing to do that? And the backstory that's relevant to this is there's a company called Keolis, which is a Rockville-based company founded in the 80s, so many decades after the Holocaust, that is it's a majority-owned joint venture by SNCF. So that's the connectivity. I won't say it was thin, it existed, but it was not the same as the French company itself doing business here. That's who was bidding for the contract. But nonetheless, the legislation was introduced. The legislation in Maryland was going to be disclosure, basically saying if you wanted to be eligible to bid for state contracts and you either did this or you're owned by someone who did this, you have to open your archives. So it was a disclosure bill that essentially said the state should know the character of the companies they're doing business with, and you should have to open your archives if you meet the following criteria. So Sandy said, would we be willing to push the hearing? And I said, I don't have a problem pushing the hearing, but why don't you say, in order to do so, they have to commit to their CEO attending and testifying? And he said, well, they're never going to say yes. And I said, yeah, probably not, but let's see what happens. They said yes. And they sent Dennis Dutey, who testified. It did not go well. There were copies of invoices that were sent by the SNCF after the liberation of Paris for reimbursement for services rendered. It was a very, very difficult day for them, and I remember it was incredible. And this was when the campaign was really just sort of kicking off nationally and starting to get a ton of attention. But Annapolis turned into the most unlikely referendum on the role of complicity and coercion in the Holocaust and the role of France in the Holocaust. And you had local delegates asking the most probing questions on France's role during the war. And it was incredible. And it was covered nationally and internationally, and it was sort of the most unlikely, but most likely place for it to happen because it was Leo's backyard. So it was incredibly interesting. It passed. Governor O'Malley signed the legislation. SNCF then put out a press release not mentioning the bill or the fact they needed to open their archives to bid, but saying in a new age of transparency, they had proactively donated their archives to the Shoah Memorial, Yad Vashem, and the Holocaust Museum. So, they did not mention the legislation, but still very good news. And it was not all of the archives, but it was, north of 1 million pages of material that had not been public or easily accessible or online before then. So certainly a very, very good development. Yeah, they must be listening. Okay, well, we're waiting for that to come back up. In September of 2012, SNCF was able to bid, but the contract was awarded to Bombardier. Then, in February of 2014, so a little less than 2 years later, and this is as the State Department negotiations are underway, and it took almost 2 years with the State Department of on again, off again negotiations, and Ambassador Eisenstadt shuttling over to Paris and coming back and meeting with us. Delegate Resnick introduced legislation that was harder hitting than the prior version, and in the broader context of the State Department negotiations and everything that was going on, said if you have done the following and not paid reparations, you're not eligible for public funds on these contracts, because we care about the character of the companies we're doing business with. And all right, we're coming back slowly here. All good. It got a lot of attention. There were hearings. This is the hearing that Leo passed away on a Saturday, and he was slated to testify on a Monday on this. And I remember, and this story is in the podcast, but I was talking to Rosette Goldstein, whose father was on one of these trains and lived in Florida that Sunday, and we were telling stories about Leo and laughing and crying, and Leo was a complete character who loved to tell really off-color jokes and could get away with it because he was both old and a Holocaust survivor. so no one called him on it. And he was the best. And Rosette and I were talking, and I said, I think we have to push the hearing. Like, I can't imagine what we're going to do tomorrow. And it was like she turned on a dime, like I had offended her. And she said, if Leo wasn't dead, he would kill you if he heard you say that. She's like, what's going to happen is you're going to get me a plane ticket. I'm going to fly to D.C. this afternoon from Florida, and I'm going to be there tomorrow to testify. And that's exactly what happened. She came, she stayed with us. We dropped my son, Zach, at the Gan at Adas Israel that morning together in his car seat. And we went on, and she ended up testifying. And it made all the difference in the world. But that moment, she just snapped into gear. There was no debate. she took the baton that Leo had been carrying and ran through the finish line. So I'm going to play a clip that'll give you a sense of how fascinating this Maryland hearing was. And this is the 2011 hearing.
The state of Maryland does not need to impose a law on SNCF or on Keolis to discuss these issues with us. We are here to discuss them with you.
Then the state delegates began to ask their questions. Here's Delegate Peter F. Murphy.
I thought I heard earlier in testimony that you claim that you were coerced. But it doesn't really connect with me that if you were coerced, that the German Nazis would then also pay you. It would seem if you were coerced, they would have no incentive.
The fact that SNCF was coerced is evidenced by a number of historical documents, the best known of which is the order which was put in each and every office just 1 month after the armistice agreement in July 1940, and which said to all the employees that if they did not comply, they would go to German courts where the standard penalty was death, not only for themselves, but for all their families.
Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick was next.
Well, we have an invoice in the record that was provided today that my colleague, Delegate Hubbard, referenced to a second ago. So there is actually proof that the company was reimbursed for transportation. So my question is, that is obviously not the only one. Are there any others?
There is no other that we know of.
May I ask the historian, please? You are the historian, correct?
Yeah.
In your documents, do you have any other invoices for transportation?
Sure.
How old was it?
I don't know. We don't know because we have only a part, the real part of the archives. And
Let me break down the question.
yeah.
Okay. The gentleman to your right, the president just stated that to his knowledge, there's no invoices are being paid. We have evidence that contradicts that. I just asked you and you stated that indeed there's some. I would like to know, since you are the historian, right? How many other invoices like the one we have in our record do you possess in your custody? How many other do you possess?
We don't have, but you have to know that you have all the archives in France are open, and you have a lot of archives in different places in France and different administration.
So not a great day for them. This goes back to the Harvard Business School case study that I mentioned. Okay, so we've really covered a lot of this. Couple other things just to touch on. So in terms of telling the story, we actually managed to launch a change.org petition. If folks remember change.org at the time, the guy who's the narrator on the podcast actually he's wonderful, does such a great job, Matthew Slutsky, who's a dear friend who worked at change.org at the time. And that's how he got affiliated with this case. He has never done podcast narration before or after, but he's fantastic. But we ended up having the fastest trending change.org petition at the time ever in their history. And Leo was like the face of it. I mean, we wrote it, but he approved it and read it. And I remember I called him the day after it launched, and I said, Leo, like it's been live for 24 hours or something now. How many people do you think signed it? And he's like, the online thing, the petition? And I said, yeah, how many do you think? He's like, 50, 60? I don't know, maybe 70? And I think at the time we had like 85,000 people worldwide. And I told him, and I mean, he was honestly speechless. He was like, I can't believe that many people read my story and know my story. It ended up getting like 180,000 people worldwide who supported this petition. I mentioned SNCF launched their Myth versus Fact website. They ran ads in the local paper in Baltimore around the time of the hearing saying, have you or one of your family members been impacted by France's deportations during the war? If so, call this number. You might be eligible for reparations. And in reality, there were reparations for French citizens who lived in France. The gap we were filling was all the non-French Jews who were deported from France, who were not French citizens or who were stripped of their French citizenship. So, you know, the play that they were advancing was suggesting that there was some sort of reparations regime already and this wasn't necessary, and it was a complete smokescreen. You know, similarly in Florida, they tried to donate money to the Holocaust, I forget the exact name, but it's a quasi-governmental agency, and under Florida law, Holocaust education is mandated to be taught in like all K through 12 classrooms, or at least in the old days, that's how it was. I'm not sure currently. SNCF donated a lot of money under the cover of night. It never went to the board. They flew the government official over to France for a week-long trip to view things and all this stuff that came to our attention. And we managed to get more than half of the Florida congressional delegation and both senators to sign a joint letter that went to the head of the Department of Education in Florida. And this guy had been on the job like 2 weeks, and this thing landed on his desk. So they undid the partnership very, very quickly, and they sent the money back. So this, again, sort of goes to us taking advantage of, you know, missteps that they made. Another really good example of that, we launched a website at the time, and the reason was people were sending in their historical documents and material to us at a law firm, and we had nowhere to put it or nothing to do with it. So we assembled all of this and put it online so that it wouldn't just be sitting in a file cabinet. Somehow, the registration of the website, I think we ended up going with like SNCF Survivors Speak or Coalition for Rail Justice or something that I think didn't have SNCF in the URL, but we registered some names that did. And, you know, from somewhere deep in the basement of the corporation, they must have been concerned about their IP, even though we were not selling train tickets, we were not impersonating them, we were saying only truthful things. So we get a cease and desist letter at Aiken, and I am maybe a 6th-year associate or so. I mean, young enough to be very concerned about the future of my career, that that someone is threatening to sue the firm over what we were doing. And I remember talking to one of the senior partners who was sort of overseeing and very involved in this case, and he said, no, this is great. Like, they're threatening to sue us in US courts for telling the story, but they're saying they're immune from suit in US courts for what they did. He's like, this is gold. I said, okay, so you're not worried about us getting sued. He's like, no, it'd be even better. We'd get discovery. So this was right at the time that we were launching the website, and we actually managed to pitch it to the Washington Post as an exclusive. They ran the story, and they agreed to include a link to our website in the story to launch it. So again, I mean, you can't really make this stuff up, but we were able to capitalize on, you know, a lot of these missteps. This is actually just a copy of the invoice after the liberation that was translated. So this next clip, so this is Jay Carney, who was press secretary for President Obama at the time, and this is just sort of one of those moments when we realized, as all the different pieces were coming together, the litigation, the state efforts in Maryland and California, the federal efforts, the public campaign, you know, there were op-eds, there was press, there was stuff everywhere. This is one of the moments that we sort of realized that we were getting much, much closer to something actually happening.
If I can ask you about something that some are saying should be discussed by President Obama and President Hollande. There's a rail company that is owned primarily by the French government-owned, its parent company, SNCF. It's bidding on the Purple Line project in Maryland, huge transportation contract with the state. And historians say that SNCF carried Jews and other Nazi prisoners to the French-German border on the way to concentration camps. And now there's critics, Democrats and Republicans in Congress, in the state of Maryland as well, who say that the rail company under this company, I know it's somewhat convoluted, should be paying restitutions to the victims if it's going to be allowed to bid on a contract because it's U.S. taxpayer money. Is this something that President Obama will address with President Hollande?
I'll have to take the question generally, and when it comes to the specific question about what they're going to discuss, I would wait for both presidents to read out their discussions to you. So I don't have a preview. Obviously, we have a broad and deep relationship with our oldest ally, and there will be many issues that the two leaders will discuss. On the broader question, it sounds like maybe Department of Transportation and others may be of more help to you, but I'll have to look into it.
It's actually a state issue, but
Or
now
state, Brianna, I just confess I'm not familiar with the details of it, so I would hesitate to provide an answer, and I'll take the question.
So he had no idea, nor should he have, but it was just sort of a demonstration that this had gotten to a sufficient level that these were the types of questions being asked, and it just, we continued to sort of double down and double down again on outside opportunities like a state visit, just realizing that there was a chance to pitch Breonna Keeler on asking a question, and if I emailed her enough, she was going to respond and get on the phone, and she did. So, it was really just taking advantage of whatever we could. So, we've talked about this, but the State Department negotiation and resolution really was kind of like three-dimensional chess, all going on in parallel with the federal legislation, the state, and then the overall press and public relations campaign. This is a picture from the treaty room that I referenced. This is the signing of the agreement in December of 2014 with the French ambassador, Sparacina Thiele and Stu Eisenstadt, and the issues that ultimately we were able to resolve to get into the room and have this done was the passage of time. Standing in the shoes, Kirill and Connie and I were just talking about this earlier, but there was an issue that really was sort of a gating problem, is that no other Holocaust agreement had ever provided for reparations for heirs. And the French very much were not willing to do that here because that would have been broader than what they did for their own citizens. And the challenge was, we were 80 years, 70 years after the fact. There were almost no survivors. The agreement would have covered almost no one if it didn't cover heirs. But the sort of compromise language was it would cover those standing in the shoes of an otherwise valid claim. So the French reparations went into effect, I think, in the late 40s. So essentially, you would start counting in the late 40s, and if the people were still alive then, it would start the clock, and then their heirs would be eligible for some portion of recovery, depending on how long they lived. It was a pretty detailed analysis, but that got over that significant challenge with other Holocaust agreements. Mentioned France is the U.S.'s oldest ally. And then the two other challenges were litigation risk. DOJ was very involved because they recognized that people were going to sue the State Department who was administering this and the Department of Justice, because inevitably there would be people who think they should be covered or who should have been covered and weren't. So they needed to make sure that that piece was addressed. And then for France, they needed closure because they did not want to get they didn't want to go through this again, as pleasant as it was spending a lot of time with us. They didn't want to go through this again. So what the State Department and the executive branch did was agree that in any future case, if one were brought on these facts, they would enter a statement of interest, trying to dismiss the case on behalf of the French government, to give them comfort that they had the finality that this would provide. This is just some language you can see coming out of the agreement, and that's the front page of the agreement that resolved this. So some of the broader things that obviously animated this whole experience and this case: corporate accountability, other reparations efforts. I mentioned that slavery was raised at times. Another very tangible impact was the Dutch Railroad. There was a similar case going on that I actually was not very familiar with, but someone sent me an article a couple of years later, and there was a quote from a very senior Dutch rail executive. They had entered into a proactive settlement with survivors and their representatives, and essentially the Dutch rail executive said, we were following the SNCF case very, very closely, and we didn't want to do anything like that. So, I mean, great continuing results. And, you know, there was also the terrific outcome of France recognizing its role in the Holocaust in a more meaningful way. And early on in the case, I think it was 2009, the railroad put out an apology, but the wording was, we regret the consequences of our actions. It was very passive. It was it was what you would expect. And over the course of years, it really evolved. And, you know, as there was sort of rising anti-Semitism and recognition, but also I think a real recognition within France that it was time to take a harder look at the past than anyone had before. And if people remember the book Sarah's Key that became a movie, there was the movie La Rafle, which was the roundup, about the roundup at the Veldiv in France, which is a wonderful movie with Melanie Laurent, which is incredibly historically accurate and really worth watching. They screwed up the distribution in the US, but it's a phenomenal film. There was much more willingness to critically examine France's role in the Holocaust than there ever had been before, and we ended up coming at the perfect moment. And fast forward to the next thing, which to me was the most important outcome of this whole case, was President Macron, at a commemoration of the Veldiv roundup, which I mentioned in 2017, said, so yes, I will say it here, it is France that organized the roundup, subsequent deportation, and consequently, for almost all of them, the death of the 13,152 French Jews dragged from their homes on the 16th and 17th July 1942. More than 8,000 were taken to the Veldiv before being deported to Auschwitz. Among them were 4,115 children aged between 2 and 16 years, whose memory we are today honoring. I know that there are those who will say that days like today and words like those that I just pronounced are a reminder of the humiliations of our country, and that it is an indecent repentance. None of that is true. This is an essential act of remembrance in history. It is our responsibility to completely reconcile our people, even in the darkest pages of our history, so that everyone can at last find their place. The idea that Vichy was a mere parenthesis, opened in 1940 and closed in 1945, supports the high idea that some have of France. It is easy to view Vichy as a monstrosity that grew out of nothing and returned to nothingness, to believe that these people came out of nowhere and received just punishment at the liberation that eliminated them from the national community. It is easy, so easy, but it is wrong, and no pride can be built on a lie. So that was a far cry from we regret the consequences of our actions, and I remember hearing that and reading it at the time and feeling like that was the whole point of all of this, the entire exercise. So we were actually able, the producers were able to find the speechwriter who wrote that speech for President Macron, who was interviewed in the podcast. And it is by far, no offense, my favorite interview in the whole podcast. It's so powerful and so much bigger than this podcast or this one story. And really, you know, I think this entire case came at a time when France was taking a much harder look at itself. And, you know, this really, to me, was the most enduring and rewarding part of it. So I'll just quickly play, and I promise I'll let you go. This is the last clip I'll play from Sylvain Fort, who was President Macron's speechwriter.
Too many people think that the recognition of the historical mistakes that we have made as a country, as a government, as people, weakens the country, you know? I do think exactly the contrary.
That's Sylvain Faure. He was the head of communication for Macron's 2017 election, and he wrote Macron's speech.
How many trials you have where people have lost a daughter or a child or something that's been murdered. The only thing that they want is the murderer to admit it. It's exactly the same for a country. You weaken a country where you don't recognize your crimes. You weaken your society and you weaken your culture and you weaken your very identity. So this speech is also a message to the new generations saying, look, maybe you would think at some point that you don't have racist or anti-Semitic ministers, that your government is not like that. You're not like that. But please be careful. You have to detect and to feel and to be aware that many, many signs, many signals in the society, in the culture, make this present. And what happened in 40 to 45 in France was not just, unfortunate. It was also rooted in the very culture of many, many parts of our intellectual landscape, political landscape, theoretical landscape.
So really fascinating. Okay, so that is it. Thank you for everyone's attention. Happy to answer questions if there are any, and then I brought some of these cards if you're interested in the podcast. This just has QR codes that you can download.
Two related questions. What country was Leo from?
Austria.
Austria. So, and related, what countries was the railroad operating in as French, and how did he, if he's from Austria, how did he end up on a French?
Great question. So he and many others were sort of running and relocating throughout Europe, and I think a lot, unfortunately, believed that Paris would be safer and France would be safer, and that's how he ended up there. And there was a camp on the outskirts of Paris called Drancy that Leo referred to as the antechamber of Auschwitz, and that's where they ran many of these, the 72 deportation trains were. So there was an internal network with all the sort of labor camps and concentration camps within France, and work camps, and there were a number, but it was mostly Drancy that deported folks towards the border.
In terms of actually the process of distributing all the money to people, how did it all go? Like, did you find a lot of people who actually needed to get that money and then they got it? And also, how exactly did it work in terms of like who was able to get it? Like, did someone have to be living in the U.S., or like what if they lived in the U.S. and then they went somewhere, or what if they never even came to the U.S.?
Great question. So it was an important issue for us that it not be France that distributed it, and we got the U.S. State Department and the U.S. government to agree that they would do it. So we did not distribute it. The U.S. government distributed, and that's why they were worried about the litigation risk, because they were distributing the $60 million, not taking any administrative fees or legal fees or anything like that. So if you read that agreement, there's detailed criteria for who would be eligible, and it was all sort of based on the French plans that existed for French citizens, and it was meant to fill the gap, but to parallel those. And you did not have to be a U.S. resident. So, there were folks in Israel who recovered and elsewhere around the world under this. It was really just meant to fill the gap for the rest of the survivors who were deported from France, who didn't have anything available to them until now.
Were heirs able to get these reparations, or only living survivors?
So that was a big issue that we ended up being able to resolve at the 11th hour, and ultimately they were referred to as people standing in the shoes of a claim. So functionally it meant that heirs could recover, but the way that it worked is that it would be someone standing in the shoes of an otherwise valid claim. Just semantics, but yeah. Standing in the shoes?
I'm not joking.
Yeah, it is, I guess, a term of art. I don't know if it's a legal term, but yeah, it's
It's used in litigation.
yeah, I've heard it. I'm not sure what doctrine it comes out of, but yeah, it did the trick. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just curious, public opinion in France while all this was going on towards SNCF, like how did it change or evolve? Was it talked about in France? Or how did that,
Yeah. It was talked about a lot. I mean, it was really interesting, like the different constituencies. And I remember, stupidly, I thought, who could be against this? Like, this, it's not a partisan issue. It's we're helping Holocaust survivors. And I invited all the heads of the different Jewish organizations to our law firm at the time, and I brought in deli for everyone for lunch, and we went around the table, and you know, to a person, everyone had their own issue, right? Like ADL was concerned about what this would do to rising anti-Semitism. You know, AIPAC or others, it was, you know, like every group, and it was, I think I just didn't fully appreciate how narrow a lens people would have looking at an issue like this. So there was definite opposition from some corners. I wouldn't say opposition. There was lack of support from some corners of the organized Jewish world, and in others, a belief that there was a better way to do this than to pass legislation, which was our belief too. I mean, passing the legislation was the vehicle. It was never really the intended goal. But it was very tricky with the organized Jewish world in a way that I did not expect going into this.
So,
So 2,000 people survived the trains. The way that the agreement was constructed is if they survived or a spouse survived, they would be able to recover, or kids of those individuals. So it was a small segment of the population, unfortunately, because it really did wipe out entire families. And this was the difficulty. And you know, Stu Eisenstadt wrote a book called Imperfect Justice, and there's no better way to say it. It left people who deserved to recover out in the cold, you know, who lost everyone and everything. You know, that was the unfortunate reality, that you had to somehow get comfortable that this was on balance positive, not just for the group of individuals, but for history and, you know, for society, and, you know, versus sort of fighting until the end for something that would never happen. So it was a really difficult, ongoing conversation and assessment.
So in very general terms, what you were doing seems like part of a vague worldwide movement to favor reconciliation. I hear it about Germany, I hear it about individual prisoners. South Africa is famous in that area. Were you involved, were you contacted by people with a broader international interest in the concept? And does it work? I mean, what is?
Yeah, I definitely started to receive some calls I wasn't anticipating for sort of other corporate accountability efforts and, you know, other things, other Holocaust efforts too. You know, I think more than anything, probably the interest was just sort of our tactical approach that was interesting to people, just because it so clearly demonstrated that absent a business interest or, you know, a financial hook, you're out of luck. And that was the only thing that changed it, honestly. I could tell you it was great lawyering and commitment to the cause. I mean, all of that, I think, was there, but it was the financial entanglement that allowed this to happen.
Did this have anything to do with the delay of the Purple Line, and did they finally?
I will defer to our esteemed elected official. No, I mean, the high-speed rail stuff fell apart sort of on its own weight anyway. I think I am by far not the expert on this. I don't think this had anything to do with the delay of the Purple Line. I mean, that legislation never passed. But yeah, no, you absolutely should. Exactly. They got the mark, the earlier contract.
But Keolis didn't get the Purple Line contract either.
Right, but that was unrelated. That was unrelated. The legislation never passed. I mean, that was just their bid wasn't accepted.
Was there any pressure put on your law firm by
Lots.
either to continue or to get out of the
Yeah.
case?
Yeah.
And did it ultimately, how did it wash out for the firm?
The firm was incredibly supportive throughout. I mean, there were some interesting moments, but yeah, you could assume that SNCF and their representatives in town at a number of our peer firms brought all the pressure they could, both individually on me and on the firm collectively, but the firm was committed to this case from day one and saw it through.
So I'm wondering if you or the firm or others have seen in this case any implications for other cases where people look for reparations from commercial firms for cases of enslavement, such as Lloyd's and other firms involved in slavery.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, not specifically on that, but just generally, I think it is an interesting sort of playbook on how to think about accountability. And certainly something I'm a defense attorney in my day job when I'm not doing this, and it's something you think about, because if you have a committed constituency, you can certainly put together something like this. But again, it relies on, I think, having sort of the traction with the business interests and the something that is moving and relevant, but then also having the stories and Leo. If Leo and Rosette had not been there to tell their stories, I don't think this would have happened. Even with the same historical recitation, it's just different. Hearing from Leo personally, who was on one of these trains, you can't look away.
Other than the live airs, was any of the money spent commemorating any of the communities or those that were lost on the trains?
Yeah, part of the agreement, I forget the exact numbers, it was like $4 million or $5 million that SNCF committed to paying to various causes. They contribute a lot of money, which is great. I'm supportive of that. If you go to the Holocaust Museum dinner, you'll see them, on the brochure. But and even in France, I mean, there's now a lot more commemoration of this than there ever had been before.
Just out of curiosity, did Leo's friend Manfred live to see this? Or?
Manfred has passed away. I think he predeceased Leo, but he was in London. I was never in touch with him. Not sure. But Leo's children still live locally, and I was just telling Kirill, like, I'm still close with his daughters, and they've been really so touched that people are continuing to talk about their dad's story and to tell the story and to listen to the podcast and read the book, and so I encourage you all to do so.
I think you said $60 million was distributed. How did you get that? How did they determine that sum?
Well, they started lower. We started higher. There was no magic to it. I mean, I wish it had been much, much higher, but I think the first number they floated was 30 million or something. I mean, there's some historical things you can look to and pull from, but other cases, it's like the Swiss banks or the life insurance, where it's grounded in something. It's like the amount of the policy was this, or the bank account had that, and those were in the billions. It was just a much different thing that you're measuring, and this was really accounting for deporting people, which is not the kind of thing that had been done before. So honestly, it was sort of as much as we could get, making as much noise as we could along the way to try to push it up.
If this had all not happened, do you think, like, still today, France, like French leadership and society would still not take ownership and accountability that they find these sort of things?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think this was all sort of happening in parallel. Like the sort of deeper look within France and the introspective, like what did our grandparents do during the war? I mean, I think this case definitely played a part in it, but I think that was already happening. I mean, we probably helped to compound it or maybe accelerate it, but I think ultimately, you know, Macron probably gives that same speech, I think, but, you know, certainly we're a big part of that narrative, but I think, you know, we came along at the right time. I don't think this would have happened 10 years earlier.
About how many recipients were there?
Low hundreds. Yeah.
Were there, besides the Dutch railway company, were there other companies that were then pursued?
There may be, not that I'm aware, I'm not sure. Any other questions? Yes.
So he jumped from the train.
Yeah.
The story, as you told the end was there, but there's got to be a lot more to that.
Oh, tons.
It's in the book.
Yeah, you have to read the book. No, I mean, Leo truly was like, I mean, he was yay tall, and he was like a real life superhero. I mean, he escaped the Nazis and Nazi sympathizers 7 times throughout his entire run through Europe, which included swimming across an almost frozen river. He jumped, the gendarmes had like scooped him up at one point and brought him to the train station to bring him back to Drancy, I think. And he jumped out of a 2nd floor bathroom window in handcuffs. So, I mean, he dug under barbed wire at a camp in Rive-Salt in the south of France that he was in to escape. I mean, they could not keep, like, this truly is like an action story of, I mean, he's probably the biggest, like, action hero the Jews have ever had. He was amazing. So, yeah, I mean, the train was one of 7 amazing, heroic escapes. Daring, yeah, yeah, no, yeah. All right, was there one more question?
Yes, what about the collaboration with the French railroad to round up Jews from other countries, which is what happened to my father? That is, you know, he also was from Austria. My parents escaped to Belgium, and then all the Jewish men, 600 of them, were arrested and put on a train. And what I'm interested in is I wonder if that was the train in Belgium, and he was taken to France to concentration camp. He was taken to a work camp.
Yeah.
In France. Was that a network of railroads that worked together to do that, or are the one you're talking about just strictly transporting people who were in France?
It was within France, yeah, and to the border.
There were other railroads.
Yeah.
Apparently there were those
Oh, yeah.
getting Jewish people and.
Yeah.
There were a lot
Yep.
of trains.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Rafi.
All right, thanks.
I need just one more minute. I'm going to take a twist. Lou, you're in the back. I promised you I would do this. Next weekend, Saturday night, mini golf for adults with all the drinking and other things that go with it, right? We love that. And Sunday for the for everybody, but especially the children. Next Sunday, that's one. And I think we have who's speaking about our next Chavurah event? Somebody? No?
It's, a date is tentative, but,
Okay.
but we are going to do another movie like we did last year, which was very well received. We're going to do something about Israel, hopefully something with an emphasis on Ethiopian, the Ethiopian subject, because Hisma is working very hard to make that happen. And when we have more information, we will let you know. And for those who don't know, Connie may have said this, this is a program of the Jewish Culture Chavurah, and if anybody is interested, Michelle or I can give you more information. And, yeah, thank you.
And 3 snacks. Thank you. It was really good. Well received.